the transition years between 1988 and 1991 with a one-year stint at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. As Black students, we had to really reclaim that space or merely create an atmosphere that was conducive for us to learn in. Our principal then, Chich Hewitt, together with his wife Jill, really made that possible for us. So thank you for this reconnection. Desmond Tutu was both Archbishop from 1986 and also my bishop in Cape Town. So he visited us at least once a year. And it was always good to see him and speak to him and reflect with him. I first met him in 1985. This was at the SACC. And when he came to Cape Town, I was selected by him in 1987 to begin my studies towards the priesthood. Before I continue, may I just say something about the context of this lecture? I'm intensely aware that this lecture happens in the midst of the most televised and yet the most denied genocide happening in Gaza right now. There are several layers of denial and obfuscation, but the odds cut through all of that when he stood next to me on a truck in Cape Town on 9 August 2014 in front of about 100,000 people in Cape Town and spoke truth to power. On that day, he called Israel a bully. This was 10 years ago, long before the events of 7 October 2023. Of course, he knew that he was being labeled as anti-Semitic by some, but it bothered him as little as being called communist by the apartheid regime because he knew it was not true. On that day, he made it clear that we are not against Jewish people or the Jewish faith, but against the evil actions of the apartheid state of Israel. I saw a t-shirt once that said, if you have not been called anti-Semitic, you're not doing enough for the Palestinians. So some of us carry that label as a badge of honor. Children are being bombed in tents as we gather. Hospitals and mosques are being attacked by an Israeli army that has always acted with impunity and continue to do so right now. The word reconciliation there, if it is to be meaningful in any way, must make sense in that context, or it will not make any sense at all. How can groups of people, some who wish that the other did not exist, be reconciled to one another? This is one of the questions I grapple with daily. I therefore wish to dedicate this lecture to the children of Gaza who are most traumatized by this war, which is effectively a war against children, a genocide. We simply cannot remain silent about this. And certainly the Arch would have shouted from the rooftops about this if he was still alive today. The lecture title, as given to me, begins with the words Christ's ambassador. Let me start with the issue of what it means to be an ambassador. And I'm very happy that Ambassador Ruby Marx has joined us from Benin. I asked a few ambassador friends of mine to tell me what it means to be an ambassador, and some of them were very clear. This is what Ambassador Ruby Marx said. She said, the formal job function for all ambassadors are fairly generic. We are chosen by the sitting president to represent our country on a bilateral basis that can be resident accredited or non-resident accredited, or on a multilateral basis that includes bilateral, but also represents our countries at multilateral organizations, such as the UN or the World Trade Organization. Our job is to maintain diplomatic relations that is derived from our national interests. We do this through ensuring trade, investment, and tourism flows to South Africa in line with our national priorities. We drive inclusive growth and job creation to reduce poverty and tackle the high cost of living and to build a capable, ethical, and developmental state. Ambassador Marx continues, our ethics and values as diplomats are derived from 4 key attributes that set us apart as South African diplomats, namely humility, patriotism, integrity, and passion. These values were forged from our history of class and race oppression and exclusion and colonialism. And I'll come back to colonialism. This means that we are particularly attuned to listen and amplify the voices of those who are weak, oppressed, and excluded. I would venture to say that for me at least, and this is Ambassador Mark speaking, as a Christian ambassador, my posting allows me to conduct a ministry of love and compassion through service. So as an ambassador of the Most High, my job is to give, to serve, to share with humility, with passion, with integrity, and with patriotism. As to what you may or may not do, and I highlighted this in my own text, anything that brings South Africa into disrepute through your personal or professional conduct, those are sometimes derived from, but not limited to, the formal job description and the behavioral qualities and attitudes I mentioned. Important to note, though, that even if it's the president who nominated us, we serve not him or her as a person, but the country who expresses the democratic will on how they want to be governed through the ballot box. End of quote. We can say that the Christ, therefore, in his good time, nominated Desmond Tutu to be an ambassador for the kingdom of God, and he had to represent the values of the kingdom here on earth through his words and his actions. And I hope to demonstrate that this is indeed what he did. Another ambassador wrote, he says, an ambassador is the highest ranking diplomat appointed by government to represent its interests, maintain diplomatic relations, and advocate for its policies in a foreign nation. So the ambassador may, one, serve as the official voice of the home country, two, engage in high-level negotiations to foster peace, trade, and cooperation, three, advocate for the political, economic, and cultural interests of the country, four, provide assistance and protection to citizens abroad, and five, promote mutual understanding and cooperation between the home and the host country. Please listen carefully to what the ambassador may not do. The ambassador may not conduct espionage or engage in activities that undermine the host country's sovereignty, may not interfere in the internal political affairs or processes of the host country, may not violate the laws and customs of the host country, and four, may not act contrary to the established norms and agreements of international diplomacy. So these are interesting definitions, because while Tutu would have represented the kingdom of God well, and while he would have protected those whom he represented, he might also have been described as something of a maverick ambassador, one who actually meddles in the affairs of the home country. He would have seen himself as an ambassador of the kingdom of God, and if there was something amiss in the country where he happened to find himself, he would say with the early apostles, we obey God more than men, or more than human beings. In a sinful world where the poor is being trampled upon or ignored, it would be the duty of an ambassador of Christ to speak out against it. Despotic governments did not particularly appreciate Tutu's meddling in their affairs. Robert Mugabe was one of them, but there were many others. Stick to your Christianity, Tutu, and we will stick to our politics. From P.W. Botha to Mugabe, to the army in Myanmar, to the Chinese, to Israel, Tutu would be told to confine his faith to religiosity and any other worldly and in otherworldly spirituality. We all know that Tutu refused to confine his faith to that which is only so-called religious. So keep these definitions of an ambassador in mind as we continue to talk about Tutu as Christ's ambassador and as a minister of reconciliation. I live in the town of Hermanus in the Western Cape. Betsy McElroy recently visited here with us, where there's a mural of the arch. The quote on the mural reads, "If you want peace, don't talk to your friends, talk to your enemies." Tutu believed in the power of talking and listening. In a 2014 message to a Talking Peace Festival in London, Tutu sent the following message. He says, "Talking is where it all starts. Talking is the wellspring of every meaningful peace process. Talking prevents conflict before it starts and helps heal wounds and reconcile differences after conflict has occurred. We are surrounded and almost overwhelmed in our media-saturated world by images of violence and war." This is 2014. I'm quoting from now. Appalling images of human beings engaged in inhumane, unconscionable activities. One doesn't know where to look. But today I want to ask you to use your ears, Tutu says. Listen to the voice of the people around you. Hear the everyday words of kindness, friendship, compassion, love. Every one of these words has power, a glue-like power to bind us together in mutual understanding and squeeze out the possibility for misunderstanding, hatred, and conflict. Keep talking peace. End of quote. I mentioned the mural in Hermanus partly because this is where the Arch and Mama Leah came to stay from 2016 to 2020. And so that was in the COVID years also. They were 5 minutes drive away from our house here, and we could see them a few times per week. During COVID, myself and Reverend Volmoed Jacobson were asked to care for them, and we were very happy to do so. The Arch was the patron of the retreat center here called Volmoed, where my work is mainly based now. And he and Mama Leah attended the Thursday morning service there. Volmoed is also the place where the Benedictine monks who used to be based in Makanda have moved to, and they also credit the Arch with their move to South Africa. On his last visit to Hermanus, the Arch experienced a transfiguration moment. I know your college is named after, because the Arch Transfiguration was important. This is one of the unique stories I suppose only I can tell. Mama Leah called me early in the morning to say that they are here and that he wants to go back to the house where they stayed. I took him there, and afterwards, on the advice of my wife, I asked if I could drive him up the mountain, and he immediately agreed. We sat there, quite high up the mountain, and below us there was a cloud cover over the sea. As the sun came through, the clouds started disappearing, and he saw the beauty of God's creation below him. He was so happy, and he immediately said, "We must fetch Mama Leah to see this," which we then did. She also joined him on that bench on that mountain above Hermanus. Every time we celebrate the Transfiguration, I think of that moment on the mountain above Hermanus. Let me delve a little bit into the background and foundation of Tutu's life and work. As you all probably know, South Africa was a country where racism, extreme racism, was the norm, and it became legal in 1948. Tutu was born in 1931, and so as a child, he would have experienced the racism of English colonialism. But by the time he turned 17, this racism became law under the National Party. The English were so focused on the Second World War that they were out-organized by the National Party and lost the election in 1948. I mention this partly to make us all aware that global events often have direct local consequences. World War II was such an event, and so was the fall of communism in the late 1980s that led directly to the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So let's keep the global picture in mind as we continue our conversation tonight. What is happening in the Ukraine, in Palestine, in the Sudan, in the Congo affects all of our lives together, whether we like it or not. In South Africa, we tend to forget or minimize the racism of English colonizers, but we must never forget that, in fact, St. Paul's College, your predecessor, was for a very long time, in fact, for the training of white male priests only. This only started changing from around the mid-70s. Tutu could have been trained as a priest there if it was not for this racist colonial policy, but being practiced within his own church, the Anglican church. But instead he trained at St. Peter's, Rosettenville. Tutu, for one, never forgot the racism of the colonizers. In a 2011 foreword in a book called You Awesome, he wrote, "South Africans are awesome because we are made from a special recipe. In our veins flow the blood of many nations. We speak 11 different languages, but often speak with one voice. The mix in our masala is right. When we were brutalized by colonialism and apartheid, forced apart into our separate suburbs and townships and buses and schools and hospitals and sidewalks, we did not sink, but swam across the tide towards the rising hope. When Nelson Mandela emerged from his decades-long incarceration, he was not bitter. We were not bitter, because we understood we were dealing with something much bigger and more exquisite than bitterness. Grace." And end quote, end of quote. For Tutu, memory was important, and the healing of that memory was important. A good friend of mine once said, yes, memory is important, but let your hope always be stronger than your memory. It was the respectful actions of a white priest, Father Trevor Huddleston, towards Tutu's mother that struck him very deeply and laid the foundations for the kind of hope that he had. He talks about this priest doffing his hat towards his mother, a washerwoman. Tutu and Father Trevor became good friends, and he would have been very aware of the latter's involvement in the anti-apartheid movement, and particularly in the formation of the Freedom Charter in 1955. By 1956, Huddleston had to leave South Africa. Tutu only started his theological studies in 1958 at St. Peter's, Rosettenville, and was made deacon in 1960 and ordained as a priest in 1961, the year after the Sharpeville massacre. By the time Tutu passed away, he was a priest for 60 years. Being trained by the CR monks had a profound effect on Tutu's spiritual practice, and he remained a disciplined monk until the end of his life. His first rector remarked that he had Roman fever. But for him, the Eucharist was central to Christian spirituality, which is why I wrote the UbunTutu Eucharistic Prayer in 2021 as part of his 90th birthday celebrations. I shall quote from it below. "I was always in awe at the way he presided at the Eucharist. It was special to behold. He was sometimes inaudible behind the altar. You had to listen very well. He took that part of his ministry very, very seriously. And you always had a sense that he was where the prophet was in Isaiah chapter 6. So the supreme basis for Tutu's reconciliation work was the Eucharist. It was this that built his faith and his spirituality. When the TRC commissioners critiqued him for turning the TRC into a Christian or religious event, he tried to take their critique seriously. But it did not last long, because Tutu was profoundly uncomfortable of the notion of working for social justice simply with a secular mindset. For him, God was everything and in everything. God was in all and through all. For him, it was all about God. For him, God was the Alpha and the Omega. If we miss this, or if we do not get this right, then we can be tempted to frame him simply as a secular social justice activist. So for me to write this Eucharistic prayer was a way to distill the most important teachings of Tutu into one Eucharistic prayer. So forgive me again as I quote at length from it. I wrote it at Pentecost, so it says, Holy Spirit, you are indeed present. You are indeed a gift. Jesus is united with you and with his Abba. You are in him and he is in you. And you are all united with us, affirming not only our humanity, but also our dignity and divinity. On the day before Jesus died, he knew that he wanted to be ever present with us, ever in community with us, so that we could always be in community with each other. Knowing that the force of division would always try to divide us, Jesus wanted to leave us a sign of that community and unity rooted in the earth and in our memory. Jesus asked for bread and wine to be gathered and sat down with his small community. Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and said, Tabatani nidle, take and eat. Neem and eat. This is my body that was given for you. Do this in memory of me. And after supper, Jesus took the cup of wine, blessed it, and said, This is my blood, igazi lam, my bloed, wat vir julle uitgestort word. That will be shed for you. Do this as often as you drink it in memory of me. He then continues, and I was particularly inspired by the film Mission Joy, where the Arch gave the Holy Communion to the Dalai Lama. He therefore reads further, Jesus, we are all made in your image, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, Buddhists and Hindus, and even those who claim to have little or no faith. Superiority is a lie. Apartheid is a sin. Division is no more. Inequality is evil. You love us all. Your love is the Alpha and the Omega. You unite where we divide. You call on us to love our enemies, to create community even with them, to bless those who despise us. Give us the strength, the will, and the grace to do that. And I will not continue reading that Eucharistic prayer. At the recent Synod of the Diocese of Cape Town, this Eucharistic prayer was used, and I hope it will be used more and more as a way to move us all away from the idea that the Eucharist is meant for card-carrying Christians only. Tutu would say quite provocatively, God is not a Christian, meaning that God is God. God is love. God is God of and for all human beings and all creation. We who happen to call ourselves Christians cannot colonize God for ourselves when he actually came for all. At best, it is anti-evangelical on our part to try and colonize God for ourselves. For those who do not know, Tutu's master's thesis at King's College focused on Islam in West Africa. Tutu's interfaith work requires a separate study, but it was an important part of who he was. It was therefore the whole work of Christ, from his incarnation to his resurrection, that guided the work of Desmond Tutu. In a video message to a conference in Côte d'Ivoire in 2012, he said the following. He said, if we are to truly understand that God loves all of us, we must recognize that God also loves our enemies. We try to claim God for ourselves and our cause, but God's love is too great to be confined to any one side of a conflict. The need for reconciliation in Côte d'Ivoire is very great indeed, just as reconciliation with God could not have happened without the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So true reconciliation among women and men cannot happen until we put ourselves in the other person's shoes and begin to relate to the other person's perspective. Reconciliation involves identifying with the other person, just as Jesus identified with us by becoming a human being. Tutu would have agreed with Martin Luther King Jr. when he said that we are not called to like our enemies, we are called to love them. Besides the incarnation, Tutu was very focused on the work of Jesus on the cross. When I visited his office at Bishop's Court one day, he said, please don't tell the people about how untidy my office is. Tell them about the flowers and the cross on my desk. He would contemplate the cross for hours. The arch was very committed to the cross of Jesus Christ and could ponder it for hours. He would agree with Bonhoeffer. He knew that the work of the Christ was free but not cheap. It cost him his life. This is how serious he was about his work of reconciliation. Jesus knew that the story of Adam and Eve had to be reversed, and as St. Paul would have it, the Christ became the new Adam. Jesus' disciples knew what this meant. Each person had to take up their cross, quite literally, and follow Jesus. Many of the early apostles were in fact crucified for preaching the crucified Christ. Tutu knew that the way to Easter was via Good Friday. We often want to jump to hope, but skip the pain and suffering. In fact, his first collection of sermons and speeches were called Suffering and Hope. He lived between these two worlds, often despairing, crying before God, but then lifting himself up and let God do God's work through him. I make all these points about his spiritual foundation and practices partly because the legacy of the Arch is in great danger of being shorn of its faith and spirituality roots and to turn the Arch into a mere secular social justice activist. We must guard against that happening. We must also guard against the Arch's legacy being twisted so much that it becomes unrecognizable and ultimately irrelevant. It is said that very few people in Norwich knows about Julian of Norwich, and we must guard against that happening here as well. So from this strong spiritual foundation, he was able to do what he did and say what he said. If you somehow miss this foundation or you choose to ignore it, you will not even be able to understand Desmond Tutu. He was who he was and did not try to be someone else. He was rooted in the scriptures. He practiced silence. If he was in silence and President Obama called him, as happened once, Obama had to wait until his period of silence with God ended. He did not have to fake it. He was simply his authentic self, rooting himself in Christ and in the cross of Christ. And so my last story on this, and I tell it for practical application. In 1993, Michael Battle and I invited the Arch to one of the poorest areas in the Cape Flats, Tafelsig, to preside and preach there on Christmas Day. I was nervous about the Arch coming and wondered how he would connect with this really poor community. I do not remember everything he said in his sermon, but I do remember him saying to the congregation, at some point he said to them, each one of you is a kettle, but a kettle is useless if it does not have water in it. So pray to God to fill you with living water. And then he continued, he said, even if you are filled with water, the kettle cannot do what it is supposed to do if it is not plugged in. So you must all be plugged into God. And finally, the power switch must be switched on. Then you can really be and do what the kettle is supposed to do. The congregation immediately caught what he was trying to say. And of course, he would famously say, faith is often caught, not taught. He could not be Christ's ambassador if he was not totally united with Christ. And neither can we be. And the way he maintained that daily unity was through a discipline of the daily offices and the daily Eucharist. I say this partly because some of you want to be priests in the church. You are paid to pray. So at the very least, do this. But also, it is important that we get away from our phones and our computers and books and visit the people at their homes. If you want to be a priest, you must be a pastor. As Pope Francis would have it, you must smell like your sheep. Too many clergy today want to lecture rather than preach on a Sunday, and our people are really hungry for God's word. They're not really interested in obscure theories of the atonement, however important that may be. Albert Nolan would say that your sermon must be the fruit of your contemplation. People are in pain. They need the healing balm of your presence, your prayers, and the fruits of your contemplation. So one pastoral story I can tell about Tutu came from a local parishioner here in an area called Gansbaai. He told me how he accompanied the Arch on a pastoral visit to a farm worker. In Afrikaans, he told me, that day I could see that the Arch could identify with the lowest of the low. Hy het met sy voete in die vuurherd gestaan. He stood with his feet in the fireplace of this old farm worker and affirmed her humanity by being present in her house. And so if he did nothing else as a priest, the Arch probably would say, visit your people daily. Tutu was also profoundly practical and clear-eyed about the work of reconciliation. For an article in a Berkeley magazine called Greater Good, he wrote in 2004, he says, for our nation to heal and become a more humane place, we had to embrace our enemies as well as our friends. The same is true the world over. True enduring peace between countries, within a community, within a family, requires real reconciliation between former enemies and even between loved ones who have struggled with one another. How could anyone really think that true reconciliation could avoid a proper confrontation? After a husband and wife or two friends have quarreled, if they merely seek to gloss over the differences or metaphorically paper over the cracks, they must not be surprised when they are soon at it again, perhaps more violently than before, because they have tried to heal the ailment lightly. We see this now in Gaza at the moment. True reconciliation is based on forgiveness. This is Tutu writing again. And forgiveness is based on true confession. And confession is based on penitence, on contrition, on sorrow for what you have done. We know that when a husband and wife have quarreled, one of them must be ready to say the most difficult words in any language, I'm sorry. And the other must be ready to forgive for there to be a future for their relationship. This is true between parents and children, between siblings, between neighbors, and between friends. Equally, confession, forgiveness, and reconciliation in the lives of nations are not just airy-fairy religious and spiritual things, nebulous and unrealistic. They are the stuff of practical politics. End quote. His critique of the pharaohs who look like us, to quote Alan Busak, knew no bounds. Tutu was disappointed that the recommendations of the TRC was not implemented. This is the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission. Those who do not know this must be reminded that the commissioners could only make recommendations. Government had to implement. The fact that government did not implement the recommendations makes the work of all commissions rather difficult and struck a blow in South Africa. It struck a blow to the rule of law. I know Judge Elizabeth Stong is with us tonight, so she will know all about the rule of law. I hope we can still recover from this, but it is difficult to imagine the Zondo Commission's recommendations to be taken seriously while the TRC recommendations are being ignored. Tutu made this point when Eugene de Kock, now Eugene de Kock was called prime evil, and Tutu did not like that particular media description of him. But he was released in prison in January 2015. And Tutu writes, he says, I pray that those whom he hurt, those from whom he took loved ones, will find the power within them to forgive him. Forgiving is empowering for the forgiver and the forgiven, and for all the people around them. But we can't be glib about it. It's not easy. He committed hideous crimes on behalf of his political and security force masters. His arrest in 1994 and subsequent conviction created the impression that the perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes would be held accountable. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 1996 as a societal balm to begin to address the process of healing South Africa's wounded soul. Platforms were created for victims of apartheid-era violence to address the nation and for perpetrators to apply for amnesty in qualifying cases, provided they were found to have been truthful. But none of the security force members identified as perpetrators of human rights violations, none who were denied amnesty, and none who managed to avoid the TRC process altogether were prosecuted. This is what Tutu says. None of them were actually prosecuted. The fact that de Kock was left to carry the load of apartheid security force evil on his own does not diminish his culpability. That fact is an indictment on our government and its prosecutorial services. Tutu goes further. He says, as human beings, we have unique capacities to reconcile, to forgive, to move on, and to love again. While many may not welcome de Kock back into society with open arms, the fact that we have allowed for his return is to our collective credit as people and as a nation. Close quote. So Tutu was not about being populist. He only wanted to do God's will and never despised the human being, no matter what evil acts the human being commits. I shudder to think what he would say about Netanyahu today. He would certainly condemn his words and actions, but he would insist God loves Netanyahu. He just does not know this yet. We would all be challenged by this. Certainly I will be challenged by this. Some people were shocked when he said that Hitler might have turned to God in the last few seconds of his life as well. So from all of the above, what can we therefore distill about Tutu's approach to reconciliation? Someone recently suggested that we should more and more use the plus sign to talk about things such as reconciliation, like LGBTIQ plus or BRICS plus. It is both a positive sign, but it's also a sign of the cross. And so for Tutu, reconciliation is therefore about talking, plus listening, plus confession, plus forgiveness, plus empathy, plus compassion, plus peace, plus justice, plus confrontation, plus grace, plus unity, plus nonviolence, plus. It's interesting that the arch would sign his name plus Desmond. So I think it's very useful to use that plus sign as much as we possibly can. It is not only one of these, but all of it together, and not necessarily in the order that I mentioned. Those looking for a straight logical line will not find it. Reconciliation is a messy business, as Christ found when he became incarnate. It is a journey, a pilgrimage. Reconciliation is about Ubuntu. Reconciliation is about good politics. All of these are contained in the Christ who came to earth for all. The arch was merely an archway for all of this to happen, an architect who laid the foundation. And yes, he was often even an anarchist. The word arch are in all those three words that I mentioned. He would have agreed with Reverend Munter Isaac from Bethlehem when he says, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, not blessed are the peace prayers. Stop just praying for peace. Start making peace. The work of Jesus can therefore really be described as systemic reconciliation, not reconciling good and evil, which of course the Kairos document critiqued, but deep reconciliation that would reconcile people with themselves, people with other individuals, people within families, people within their tribes, people across tribal lines, people across national groups, global reconciliation of nations, reconciliation with the whole of creation. What the church, every congregation needs to become now are new communities of reconciliation, small communities where Ubuntu is practiced. One of the dangers of the church today is that the secular spirit could completely weaken it. Faith that was good enough for our mothers and our fathers can be seen as naive and be ridiculed. Rugged individualism is part of that secular spirit. Michael Battle would say that rugged individualism leads to atheism, while Ubuntu leads to faith. In the days when Tutu led the SACC, he would say to the apartheid government, "You represent 4 million people. I represent 14 million people." How do we hold on to the spirit today so that governments and others must think twice before they ignore the poor and simply focus on the elite? If the church can continue to represent the voice from below, we can also ensure that reconciliation happens from below. This would be authentic reconciliation, real reconciliation, deep reconciliation, systemic reconciliation. What will it take for all of us to do this? There's a deep spirituality of Tutu, one that is not only contemplative, but deeply mystical, and one that we can all strive for, one that focuses on purgation, illumination, and union. That's a story for another day, best to be addressed by someone like Dr. Michael Battle. And so I want to end this lecture with an appeal for prayer. Please pray for Mama Leah, for Tandeka and Nontombi, and pray also for Trevor and Mpho. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwin, for a stimulating talk on the reconciliatory ministry of Archbishop Emeritus Tutu. We've got some time for questions. Maybe if people use the hand up on Zoom, people in the room, you can also use a physical hand, and then we'll bring them to the computer and they can ask their questions here. I just want to check if there's any hands at the moment. Thank you.
Betsy.
Hello, my friend. It's good to see you. It's been
I see you have another friend in the background there.
Deacon Tom, who I invited to join me to your conversation this morning. It was wonderful. Thank you, Edwin. One of the comments that I noted while you were talking is about the idea of reconciliation coming from relationship. And this came up a lot over the last couple of weeks. And one of the things that dawned on me during our time together was the idea that no relationship ever is set. I think I was a little bit naive traveling to South Africa thinking I would see something fixed. And I didn't see anything fixed. And I think sometimes I want it to be fixed. We've done the thing, we've checked off the thing. But just like any relationship, nothing ever is static. It's constantly moving. And in order to do that, we have to be in constant relationship, checking in, constantly apologizing, constantly responding. It's always going to be moving forward. And I think your lecture here in the idea of systemic reconciliation and that kind of thing just reminded me of that epiphany that I had of how, just like relationships, this is ongoing work that will never end until the kingdom comes. So
right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you wanted a response, Betsy, but thank you for that comment. And I'm not sure if we should wait for 2 or 3 people to comment and then let me respond.
I think you can go ahead and comment just now. If someone else puts a hand up, we'll we will come to them.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, thank you, Betsy, and I mean, thank you again for being with us the last few weeks here in South Africa. For those who don't know, we have a Tutu seminar twice a year, one in January, one in August, and Betsy just joined us from California for that seminar now in August. I love your comment. I think the issue for me sometimes is just about proximity, really, about getting as close as possible to other people, you know, and getting into that person's shoe. As you know, I work with young people, and recently I asked him to draw a big M on a piece of paper, and I had 4 of them standing, you know, over the paper, and I asked the person looking at the M's, "What do you see?" I see an M. Then, "What do you see?" "Well, I see an E." "What do you see?" "I see a W." "What do you see?" "You know, I see a 3. Now, standing in different points, you have different perspectives, and then I let them move so that they can actually see the 3 rather than the E or whatever. And I said it's important that you actually get into the other person's shoe to be able to understand. So absolutely, relationships is everything. We have to find a way to build relationship between the 7 million Israelis and 7 million Palestinians, you know, and even if we can only build between, say, 5 million and 5 million, that's fine. At least we'll be able to do that. And it's only that will eventually allow them to be able to live together in some way. As South Africans, we know that. We know that we were on the brink of a civil war here, and we knew that it was the wise leadership of people like Mandela and Tutu took us away from that brink. So yes, thank you for that. I know Ambassador Ruby Marks would like to say something.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity and inviting me as well to sit in on this session. So many thoughts are going through my head because as I'm listening to you in particular, Edwin, I recall some time ago when I was serving as ambassador to Sri Lanka, and we just had the Easter Sunday, the very bloody Easter Sunday bombing, where so many worshippers were killed because of suicide bombers. And I remember having a conversation with our now retired Deputy Chief Justice, Chikane Museneki. And we were talking about some of our experiences, yours and mine, that overlaps during the 80s. And I was talking about the experiences that I had in Sri Lanka, trying to find ways in which we could be of support to so many people who had lost family members in that deadly bomb attack. And he said to me something that came back to me as I was listening to you. He said to me that our generation, yours and mine, we were really child soldiers who were deployed into a civil war, right?
Yeah.
And which we willingly participated in. And that we participated in, driven by a very strong and fierce sense of justice. And that, I believe, is still what drives us to do the work in the respective lanes. We, you know, myself as a diplomat and you also as an ambassador of Christ for so many years. So what I wanted to say is that, you know, Desmond Tutu, such a small man in stature, but he looms so large over the history of our liberation struggle, but he looms equally large in the lives and the imagination of communities, of countries where people find themselves marginalized, oppressed, and just disenfranchised. And so as someone who works in the international sphere, I wanted to say something about how his example and his actions had shaped my own consciousness, and that led me to become an activist ambassador in the countries where I served. And I think particularly of a visit that I undertook in my capacity as ambassador to the Rohingya refugee camp in Cox's Bazar.
Right.
I think some people might know that we still have a huge refugee community that was driven out from Myanmar to neighboring Bangladesh. And I remember that I went there and I insisted that South Africa had to be there, because I believe that even if we couldn't do much in terms of making contributions, etc. Of course, I didn't go empty-handed, but our job is really to bear witness to what people were experiencing. And sometimes the act of bearing witness is such a critical moment for people in which they are able to re-engage again with a sense of radical hope that things could be different and that they are seen and that the world is watching. And it was the same in Sri Lanka as well. So I want to say that I take the arch with me wherever I go.
Good.
And I hope that he is proud of the work that many of our ambassadors are doing. But I also wanted to say something about the issue of hope, because the last speaker spoke about Ubuntu. And I wanted to say that our job, and I think many of us come into this work of bearing witness and working with communities who are disaffected. We come into this work as wounded healers ourselves,
Right.
particularly because we had gone through particular experiences. And so how we carry that wound forward into healing is really to give people a sense of reasonable hope. It's a term that was coined by Weingarten, I think. He talks about the fact that if we can do our work with a sense of reasonable hope, and see our problems that we have in our countries, etc., as real and as solvable, then that gives us something to move forward from. And because I think that as wounded youths, we often feel, overwhelmed by a sense of despair. But finally, I just wanted to say that reasonable hope, radical hope, and Ubuntu, these are all relational. It happens between and amongst people. And it creates an energy that I believe that it can be galvanized across the world. Something a better world can emerge from that. So I just wanted to share that. I wasn't going to speak, but I thought I would share that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for the work that you do. And I agree. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. Ryan asks in the chat, he asks, is it important to mobilize your community or congregation when standing up against injustice? Or is it better to stand up regardless and have the community congregation join in support as a plus? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, Ryan, but let me attempt, unless you want to add something to that. So do you want, I see you online. Is there something you want to add?
Thank you for the lecture. It was really insightful and really interesting. I really enjoyed it so much. My question is one where the Arch is someone really influential and someone who had a lot of charisma and often had a lot of people stand in consolidation with him. And just thinking sometimes one could be isolated in a community standing against injustice. And it could be a lot of hard work in terms of getting others on board and mobilizing them to see the injustices that's happening in your very community, or sometimes in a different part of the world. So my question comes from that: as an individual, is it important to make that move to gather others in solidarity, or do you go forth and stand and if they join, it's a plus, or you stand as an ambassador for doing what is right, whether others join you or not?
Yeah, one of the things that I often say to people is I'm a both and kind of person. Yes, there were people in London protesting apartheid, and some of them would stand alone with a poster outside the embassy at Trafalgar Square, sometimes in the cold, in the rain, whatever. And so that is sometimes necessary. I mean, I went into my congregation on Sunday when I was 18, 19 years old, perhaps at that time, and I would go with the UDF T-shirt on, and some of the congregation members were very upset with me because I was now disturbing their worship, you know. And I just felt I had to do that because I wanted to really shake them up to some extent. And as the young lions then, that was our job, you know. We had to shake up our congregations. And so even if there was all the older people were against you, you kind of had to stand. But that was not the end of the story. The point is we wanted to mobilize them. The point is we wanted them on our side. We wanted them to join in the struggle. And so both and, you know, stand. If you have to be the only person who stand, you know, then you stand. But ideally, Ruby and I would have been involved in things like mobilizing, organizing, you know, that kind of work is the kind of work that we were involved in to ensure that we get to the end of the apartheid system. So yeah, both and that's where I would stand. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We have time for maybe one or two more questions if there are any. I know I have one question which is more about there is this notion that maybe the church has surrendered some of the space that would have been occupied by people like Archbishop Tutu in standing up for justice. Whether that's right or wrong. But I'm just wondering, is there a sense in which you're saying that it's not about social activism from a secular point of view? Do you think that maybe there is a need to rediscover the kind of spiritual foundations that Tutu's ministry was flourishing from to encourage the church to take that space of imagination and to build a better world for all?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I just want to say welcome to Dr. Michael Battle. Michael, you just arrived in time. Oh, he seems to have left again. Oh, there you are. You arrived in time for the closing prayer. I call him the late Michael Battle. But good to have you. I've already done the lecture, so we are now in the question and answer series part of this. Sure. Where to start with your question? That's a big one. So thank you for asking the question. I think we are in danger of losing the prophetic edge in the church, and the tradition, and this is why these kind of things are so important. To keep the memory alive of it. The tradition in which Tutu stood was the prophetic tradition. And it is important, and of course I can't see how many of your students are present in the room there, but it's important that as the students gather and reflect on theology and what it means to be a theologian today, that they really reflect on what, say, Richard Rohr would call contemplation and action. The combination of these two. The danger of social justice activism is that you become a mere activist. And in no time, I mean, I've been an activist for more than 40 years now, so I can talk about this. It's so important that we fill our tanks constantly and we keep it constantly filled. in order to deal with the new challenges, the new evils that arise every single day. And you cannot do that. I don't think that one can do that effectively, and particularly as a Christian or as a priest. I don't think we can do it without spiritual sustenance, and, being sustained daily, whether it's with the Eucharist, whether it's with the daily offices, and so on. Someone remarked one day, I think it was John Allen, who actually said that the difference between the Methodist clergy who all went into politics and the Anglican clergy was actually the daily office. It was the daily office that sustained us, that kept us going, and also kept us to some extent away from simply merely going into the political realm. And so we must understand that we bring something special to the conversation. When Ruby spoke earlier on, I was thinking of Ashley Krill, the activist who was killed here on the Cape Flats in the 80s. Ashley, we were friends with Ashley. And, he tried to recruit me into the underground, into MK. And my response to him was that I completely respect what he does and what the other people do, but I choose the path of nonviolence. And so, having chosen the path of nonviolence, Tutu taught us that we shouldn't just talk about nonviolence. He always said we must take the adjectives very seriously. It must be vigorous nonviolence. And so stop talking simply about nonviolence, but talk about vigorous nonviolence. And that made us think about the kind of actions that we had to engage in. And the more you can engage in these actions together with others, and the more you can sit back and reflect on and learn, what has happened, you kind of become, I want to say, tougher in the process. So that as things get thrown at you, you can deal with that. So I got to the point where I was detained once, and I was driven from Johannesburg down to Cape Town as security police, and somewhere close to Cape Town, they offered me a beer, and I said to them, "I'm sorry, I don't drink with my oppressor." So these were two big security branch people, and I was a thin little 20-year-old, whatever. But I could speak with such confidence to them, and they could do nothing, and I can tell you many more stories like that. But I do think, to come to your question again, I do think that congregations must reflect together on what their faith means in their particular context, and that every congregation should become a community of hope, a community of reconciliation, every single congregation, and that they must ask themselves the question, what does that mean for us here? And it doesn't matter which context you are in. What does that matter? What does it mean for us here? And we learn certain things along the way. With Father Albert Nolan, we often spoke about the different things to, how to act against poverty. So there's poverty alleviation, then there's poverty reduction, poverty eradication. But you could become involved in simple poverty alleviation things, handing out bread, parcels, and those kind of things. But in that process, as you ask the question why, you can move into a deeper space. So hopefully don't stay in that one particular space, but recognize and accept that is where some people are, and maybe some people will stay there, but constantly ask the question, why? Why are people poor? Why do people suffer? Why do these things happen? And the more we ask the question why, the more we do that analysis, we go through that cycle, see, judge, act cycle. In that way, you grow the consciousness. And really, I want congregations to really think seriously about this. Stop just staying with the things that and with the old hymns and so on and so forth, but rather start asking the questions. And then ask, the what is this WWJD question? What would Jesus do? What would the prophetic Jesus do in these particular situations? Because if we can get to the answer of what Jesus would do, then we know that is what we should be doing. And then sort of not only simply then be advocates, but be witnesses. Be with the people, suffer with them, struggle with them. I can speak about it forever, but I think let me stop there. Thanks for your question. I hope I answered your question somehow.
Thank you very much. I see there's a question in the chat. Maybe if there's no more hands come up immediately, maybe that will be the last one. I haven't actually seen what it is.
In what ways can we as the church actively participating in dismantling systemic racism in our South African societies? Good question. Good question. Systemic racism. Once again, I think it's important that we dismantle this racial debate and this racial structure, actually. And so by merely focusing on the kind of things that people do, and sometimes I say to people, I say, let's just talk about the different kind of things. Let's talk about different words. Let's talk about what is multiracialism. That's something that happens in our societies. Then let's talk about what is non-racialism. And then let's talk about what is anti-racism. And there's a few others. Now, just by having those kind of conversations, by dismantling all of that, you'll begin to understand what it all is. And by the way, just as I said about the poverty alleviation, poverty reduction, and so on, it might be that some people actually enter the non-racial space through multiracialism. But once they enter that space, they can start asking critical questions about it, and allow people to grow in their understanding. Remember, we came through a particular period. We came through the BCO period. We came through the Black consciousness period in the 70s and early 80s. And we made a decision then that all those of us who are not white will be called black. We were all black. So someone like myself, nowadays people easily use the term colored, but I still don't feel comfortable with that term. Because we struggled for this, we actually went through this process where we were called black, and it was black unity. And mixed with that came the whole debate around non-racialism. Now, non-racialism is a long story. It comes from someone called Benny Keys, Advocate Benny Keys from the non-European unity movement. Benny Keys was the one who actually came up with the idea of non-racialism as opposed to just being called non-European. So there's a kind of reaction to being called being a non-person or a negative of someone. So non-racialism was in response, in fact, to that. And then anti-racism is to take the stand against all forms of racism. And in the South African context, we would say we want Black leadership. We want to promote Black leadership. That's why we elected Archbishop Tutu, and we elected Jongo, and we elected Thabo, and so on and so forth. So that's part of what we do as part of our action. So even if our white comrades come alongside us, we had people like Bishop David Russell, we had Albert Nolan and others who actually taught us, Bayers Nodia, who taught us how to stand in solidarity with those who suffer most. And so, gosh, I hope I'm not going off your question. Let me just come back to your question. Your question is, how do we dismantle systemic racism? You dismantle it by actively acting against it, and doing so daily, and learning the lessons of it, and making mistakes even, sometimes we do make mistakes in the struggle. So we must accept that, and we can reflect with each other about that, and never dehumanize the other person, so a white colleague and wants to join you, it's important that that person be allowed to join in the struggle, but not be not be dehumanized in the process, but that he or she be fully accepted into the family, as it were, as long as we understand that we are all against racism and that we want to structurally and systemically dismantle that whole system of white superiority and whiteness.
Thank you very much then. I think that it's time to bring proceedings to a close. We thank you very, very much for a stimulating talk, and it certainly stands with all the others that we have had in the last couple of years, and we hope there'll be many more to come as we continue to engage with Archbishop Emeritus Tutu's legacy, with his ministry, and with the lessons that they can teach us for the present and the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless.
Just a word for everyone that is with us tonight. We are having the next in our series on the 1st of October 2024, when a former student, Nathano Muller, will be speaking on the theme Desmond Tutu's Legacy, an Exploration of Gender Justice and Reconciliation in Anglican Liturgical Practice. It'll be here on Zoom on the 1st of October 2024, so watch out for the link, and we hope to see you then. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.